Canada West Foundation, we're a not-for-profit charitable enterprise, and so we don't have huge honoraria to give to any of you, but the art that you see here at the Manitoba Club, just take whatever you want, and that'll do. Look, I'm so pleased to see such a great turnout of people from Winnipeg and throughout Manitoba to be here today. We have a number of individuals that I've met with already, and some of whom I hope to meet over the next little while. But let me start with introductions of our three panelists. Erin O'Toole is the President and Managing Director of ADIT North America, and as such, he provides, ADIT North America is a globally integrated risk advisory firm specializing in strategic intelligence, international trade, due diligence, security, and compliance. And as you will all know, he is the former leader of the Conservative Party of Canada and was the leader of the official opposition. He also served in the Canadian Armed Forces as a captain, and that leads me to go to our next guest, our panelist, retired Major General Colin Keiver, a military officer who, again, I've known for a little while, and he comes from Alberta, a small town called Three Hills, which is somewhere between one hill and two hills. And he, of course, has had a distinguished career in strategic and tactical airlift and search and rescue, staff roles including the Defense Program Coordination Director General of the Air and Space Force Development, and finally as Deputy Commander of the Royal Canadian Air Force, which celebrated last year its 100th anniversary. Finally, Jessica Shadian. This is the first time I've met Jessica. I know it won't be the last. Dr. Shadian is the President and CEO of Arctic 360. This is Canada's preeminent Arctic think tank that works with Indigenous corporations and northern governments, the federal government and the private sector, Arctic leaders, and other institutions around the circumpolar region. She's an author of The Politics of Arctic Sovereignty, Oil, Ice, and Inuit Governance, a history of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, ICC, and Inuit sovereignty in global politics. So I think that when you look at what our subject matter is today, we brought to you three really fantastic panelists and guests. So just as an introduction, we sent out an email to all of our panelists and asked them, what are the things that you want to talk about? A couple of topics that were really main topics that were common among you: military defense and critical minerals. Both need infrastructure, both need investment. All three of our speakers identified infrastructure. What do we need to do? How do we build it? How do we finance it? And Jessica talked about President Trump and critical minerals. That's an area that she flagged. There are critical minerals in the Arctic, and we need the infrastructure in order to mine them. That means roads, ports, telecommunications, energy, and also training for a workforce. Now, this is a very topical discussion that we're having today because of announcements just even in the last few days. Yesterday, the QIA and the Nunavut government announced a $34 million research and training facility for Pond Inlet. I've been there. I spent my 19th birthday in Pond Inlet. It was an extraordinary place. I've traveled all over the Arctic. I've been as far north as places like Alert. I've been as far north as 83 degrees north latitude. I'll make this observation about why I think the Arctic has been largely ignored for so long, and that is you cannot love that which you do not know anything about. And very few Canadians ever get the opportunity to have the opportunity that I've had to travel to all three territories, to actually live there. I lived in a tent for 4 months looking for minerals with a company in my young days. Also, funding from Mary River Inuit Impact and Benefits Agreement, Canmore, Nunavut, Tunngavik, and the federal government. Today, Location announcements. Minister Blair announced Iqaluit, Inuvik, and Yellowknife as locations for 3 planned northern operational support hubs. Hubs support our 2024, our North Strong and Free strategy announcement of $2.67 billion for Arctic security program, and a 20-year commitment to increase the military's presence in the region. And so with that background, again, I thank not only our panelists, but also all of you for coming here today. So I got some questions, and I'm going to start with Erin O'Toole right off the hop. Erin, the Northwest Passage. How do we navigate opposing views on this polar route in the age of President Trump?
Well, thank you, Gary. It's a pleasure to be back in Winnipeg, place I got my wings in the RCAF at the base here and lived here. So you're a true Canadian if you survive a winter in Winnipeg, right? So I'm legit now. This is probably the sleeper issue that most people haven't paid attention to in the last number of years. And COVID was a time where we were obsessed about COVID and didn't really see what the first Trump administration did with respect to our Arctic sovereignty and the Northwest Passage. So as you may know, Gary, and probably most of this room, Prime Minister Mulroney and President Reagan had a treaty on the Arctic and the Northwest Passage where the Americans did not accept our claim that the Northwest Passage was all internal waterways, but they devised a courtesy between friends and allies. Remember those days when we were friends and allies with our friends in the United States? But it was a courtesy that the Americans would advise when they were going to have a naval ship transit through the Northwest Passage. A submarine too, but we'd never know if it was submarine was transiting through the Northwest Passage. So it was mainly for surface vessels. And Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, walked away from that treaty, abrogated it in the midst of COVID, and I think I saw 2 news stories on this topic. Why is that important? At a time in the last 15 years that Russia has militarized the Northeast Passage, there's 3 polar routes that are going to be more and more in use in the next 10 to 20 years. The Russians have been preparing theirs. There's an overall polar route, and then there's the Northwest Passage. And we are literally the only country that looks at the Northwest Passage as being internal waterways to Canada. And when your closest ally in the world power walks away from it, even acknowledging our claim, that was probably the biggest erosion of our sovereignty since maybe the Battle of Queenston Heights or something like that. And so we're not prepared as a country. We've been a bit asleep at the switch. I'm really happy that Minister Blair announced all of our policies from a few years ago, just today, and so better late than never. But we as a country really have to start taking this seriously. And something explored at Jessica's most recent Arctic 360 annual conference is perhaps, if we can ever get the Americans back to normal relations again, maybe we could look at the Northwest Passage like we do the St. Lawrence Seaway. Because if you're exiting or entering through Alaska, there is a joint element to this polar crossing. And even they're insufficiently staffed with icebreaking capacity. They even have challenges in their Arctic region. So this is an area we should collaborate. We've got to step up so that we can actually collaborate as a real partner. But if we don't get serious, any of our ability to project our own sovereignty and our own domain or dominion is diminished. So I'm really glad when you wanted to focus on this, Gary, because we need more concerned Canadians being aware of these issues.
Thanks, Erin. Look, this is a very broad question for you, Colin. I mean, how does the military see the Arctic?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think I just want to start by saying thank you for inviting me out here. My family and I spent 12 years total in Winnipeg. We survived 12 winters. Our daughter was born here, and so coming back, it is in many ways like coming home, one of those many homes we had over my career. I also want to note you missed a key item in my biography. and that is that I've been sanctioned by the Russian government since 2022, and I'm extremely proud of that fact. So,
I was sanctioned earlier than that.
well
And
done.
so was James, so was James.
But seriously, it's a really interesting question. I think we tend to, as a military guy, I'll be honest, I'm a little uncomfortable answering the question, and I don't think the solutions to the Arctic are military solutions, quite frankly. They're much bigger than that. But the military has a key role to play, ensuring that we can do what needs to be done in the Arctic in terms of being aware of what's going on up there and all of those other things. There are key threats that the military sees from an Arctic perspective, and there's some really interesting numbers that you need to keep in your head. If you were to fly from Toronto to Canadian Forces Station Alert, which is the northernmost occupied permanent station in the world, way up there at the end of Ellesmere Island, it would take you longer to fly from Toronto to Canadian Forces Station Alert than it would take you to fly from Toronto to London, United Kingdom. And an alert is actually closer to Moscow than it is to Ottawa, which is why it's there, because of what it does up there. So I just put that into a context that this is a massive tract of land and a massive realm of geography that is probably one of the most austere, dangerous operating environments in the world, quite frankly. In the Air Force, we always said that if we could get someone to the point where they could operate safely and effectively in the Arctic, then we knew we could send them anywhere in the world and they would do just fine. You have no outs up there, the weather changes constantly. So it's an incredibly demanding environment, which actually is the first threat the military sees, is the environment in and of itself and the ability to operate. From a pure military threat perspective, we kind of need to be careful here in the sense that there is, on the balance of it, there is no direct military threat to the Arctic. The threat comes from the fact that the Arctic regions are a real useful shortcut, if you will, for people with bad intentions to make their way to North America and our critical infrastructure that would lie in southern Ontario or the industrial areas of the United States, things like that. That's the fundamental premise. So there is, I wouldn't say zero probability, but maybe a 1% probability of a seaborne land invasion in the north. It's just not going to happen. So what you have from a military perspective, you have threats that they're air-based, they're maritime-based, they're things like that. And it's fascinating. I was at the Ottawa summit yesterday on security and defense. I sat and listened to the director of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service and the Communications Security Establishment, both of them in violent agreement, as well as the National Security Advisor, in violent agreement that in all of this, of course, cyber is the #1 threat to Canada right now. And if you think about our ability to project into the north and do the things we need to do, communications, all those other things, a well-positioned cyber disruptive event would literally knock out our rail systems, our banking systems, our communication systems, and quite frankly, jeopardize our ability to operate that far north. And I think the key piece here is we look at it from a military perspective. At the high strategy level in the military, we always use the acronym DIME. There's 4 ways in which nations and organizations operate and interact with each other at the strategic level. There's the diplomatic sphere, there's the information sphere, there's the military sphere, and there's the economic sphere. And from my perspective as a senior officer in the Canadian Forces, there is no solving the challenges of Arctic and the Arctic sovereignty issue for Canada without looking at all 4 of them. If all we do is focus on the military aspect, we will not solve what needs to be done up there. And I'll close by saying that the world is becoming incredibly, incredibly complicated. And what that tells me as someone who's spent most of my life measuring and managing risk, what I see now is a world that is becoming increasingly determined by probabilistic outcomes as compared to deterministic outcomes. And risk as a function of probability and intent, the more probability you have, then you've got to start doing things to buy down risk. And I can save that for another question, but I think there are certain key things the nation needs to focus on to buy down that risk as it relates to the north.
Thanks, Colin. You mentioned that we live in this complex environment. In military terms, it's often referred to as VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. I might reserve a question for that for you later, how you plan in a VUCA environment. But the thing that you said that I think is a great segue into what I want to ask Jessica is this. You said it's not just a military perspective, it's a lot of other things. So what I want to ask you, Jessica, is it's just not what we need in the North, but how we're going to do it. What do we need to build? How do we build it? How do we finance it? Arctic Seaway infrastructure, what's our strategy? How do we attract private capital and so on? So I'm going to turn that over to you, Jessica.
Perfect. Well, thank you for having me and the invitation. I actually want to back out a bit and connect. If we want to answer those questions, I think we need to, I'd like to put this conversation into the broader context of geopolitics. And I'm saying these not because I read X or Twitter or what have you. It's because of I'm a dual U.S.-Canadian citizen, and I've lived in the Norwegian North for 5 years, and I have a PhD in global politics. So if it sounds alarming, it's based on my experience and things that I read. But so when we're talking, a lot of the conversations here right now in Canada, we're talking about, and I heard it just again yesterday, that this is a declaration of an economic war when we talk about the tariffs and the tariffs that are happening. Well, the conversations that are taking place among our European allies, they're talking about the wartime economy. And right now they're restructuring their economies and their policies accordingly. And so Canada is an Arctic nation. And so I just want to ask this question, is what is happening today for Canada, is this an economic war, or should we be thinking in terms of a wartime economy? And so here's a few thoughts to consider. So going back to a seaway. So what sits in between the US state of Alaska and Greenland? It's our entire Arctic coastline, which is 70% of our entire coast. Donald Trump, again, in his congressional address, he stated that the US will take Greenland one way or another, and we know that force is one of those stated options. We should act, I think, by the assumption that it's real when he says that he wants to annex Canada. So outside what is happening with Ukraine, the US and Russia, they're also discussing Arctic cooperation around natural resource exploration and trade routes in the Arctic. We know, as Erin has discussed, that the United States has never agreed that the Northwest Passage is internal waters. We know, as we've talked about, that our north has large quantities of critical minerals. We know it's underdefended and underdeveloped. It lacks the necessary critical infrastructure, not only for defense and social infrastructure, but also required for functioning economies and trade. And then I'm thinking building up then a critical minerals economy. And this includes what we don't have, which is ports, roads, airports, fiber cables, energy, the list goes on. So turn over then to Ukraine and this new US minerals deal, one could maybe say is being forced upon Ukraine. This deal is not only about critical minerals from what I have read, and maybe anyone could correct me if I'm wrong, but it's also about natural resources, and it also talks about owning ports, airports, and other critical infrastructure, both present and to be built in the future. And so we could say, yes, while the US is having a very hard time even building one icebreaker, Russia has 46 of them. And I'm pretty sure that they'd be willing to maybe loan one or two to the US. So for me, when CSIS delivers a warning that global geopolitics makes the Arctic, I'm going to quote, an attractive, strategic, and vulnerable destination for foreign adversaries seeking to establish a presence in Canada, I just have to ask, are we really only talking about China? And so I'm just going to start with that, and then we can maybe get more into some discussions about infrastructure. And
Okay, that's a lot to bite off. And let me say this. I'm going to ask all of you. I find that this is quite helpful because everybody carries a cell phone. So here's my phone number. 511. I see Anna Marie is here, and she saw me do this at an event for the Asper School, and I think it worked out pretty good. So look, let's go to the VUCA issue, Colin. I mean, we live in a volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous environment. How do we plan in that kind of environment when it comes to dealing with issues in the Arctic?
I think you got to go to first principles. You've got to look at this from a national strategic perspective. And I would ask. I mean, it's been 20-some years since this nation published a national security strategy. Perhaps that would be a great place to start. And get your hand around all of these issues in a cohesive manner that allows you to articulate, not just ends, but ways and means, and actually start to build out to achieve that strategy. To me, that's a key point. I've always been struck by, frankly, how naive Canada has been over the years with regards to national security and what that really means. So I think that's a key first step. You've got to have a discussion.
Is that because we had 3 oceans and a friendly border?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that world doesn't exist anymore.
No, and I think that's the key point here is, this world is becoming really, really complicated. To your point about VUCA, you've got a situation now where if something bad happens, there is no such thing as a regional conflict anymore. It will reach out and touch every single one of us in not necessarily pleasant ways. And I think, from a military perspective, we always try to measure things in terms of, we never want to get to that point because most of us have spent any time in uniform at all know that when you get to that point, nobody actually wins. The Industrial Revolution brought about the First World War, 12 million dead in the First World War, 45 to 60 million dead in the Second World War. If you look at what's going on in the Ukraine right now with digitalization and integrated systems and precision fires, 60 million is a drop in the bucket. All right, if this goes that way, we really can't do that. So it really becomes about building out, from a strategic perspective, a national perspective, what's important to you, what do you want to protect, what are the core capabilities you would see requiring in order to do that. And and to Jessica's point, I think there is cause for concern with what's going on in the United States. But I think if Canada gets to the point where we are truly alone and unafraid with regards to our neighbors to the south, then we're in a world that none of us want to be in, and quite frankly, 10 or 15% of GDP on defense isn't enough. So there's got to be partnerships in here that need to be worked. They absolutely have to be. And so, when I look at what we build out in the Arctic, to deal with this complexity and ambiguity, it's about domain awareness. It's about understanding literally from sea floor to space what is going on up there to everyone's benefit, whether it be the First Nations or mining companies or the military or whoever it is. That's the first key piece is domain awareness. And then from there, once you have domain awareness, then you need to be able to project and do things up there with whoever is doing them. And this is really interesting. I saw that they're about to put on orbit 6 satellites that are able to detect wildfires in Canada. Well, a satellite that can detect wildfires in Canada is a satellite that can detect missile plumes coming to Canada, because they use exactly the same technology. So this is where you've got to really start looking at dual use. Things like cracking the communications challenges of the North. Most satellite communications do not work north of about 65, 68 degrees because of the geosynchronous orbits. Well, you could put a LEO constellation up over this nation that would give, those communities up there fiber connections that have more bandwidth than the fiber links in your house right now. And the military could use it. There's 100 ways to get after this, but I think you deal with the complexity by A, deciding it's important, and B, starting to build things out that allow you to start seeing through that complexity in terms of that domain awareness, and then making decisions about where you're going to act and what you're going to do.
Thanks. I'm going to go to Erin, and this touches upon what Colin just said of having multi-use infrastructure investment plans. Major investment in the Arctic should have a dual or multi-use dimension that encompasses security, economic development, and social cohesion, roads, ports. I mean, Erin, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, thanks, Gary. This is something I've commented on, and I wrote an op-ed in the Hill Times so that my friend James Bazan, a great MP, could read it, because all the MPs get the Hill Times. No one else reads it, but if you want to influence Parliament Hill, well, some keeners read it. But I wrote about subsea cables, and I write sometimes. I come to these events also just to prove to people, yes, Erin O'Toole is still alive. People kind of say, what happened to him after he left
Hey,
Parliament?
look, it's better to be gone than not forgotten
That's
than
right.
forgotten but not yet gone. I mean, just to be clear.
Exactly. But the Arctic is something I talked about from my 10 years in Parliament, because I first went there in the Air Force before the creation of Nunavut, when Iqaluit was still Northwest Territories. And you saw that what you say, you can't love what you don't see. Most Canadians don't get that incredible opportunity to see that. And most of our landmass, most of our coastline, as Jessica said, is there. And I wrote on something benign, but it's called subsea cables. And so there's a Canadian company called IT Telecom that has laid thousands of kilometers of subsea cables along Alaska, lighting up remote communities. This is a Canadian company, Arctic hulled ships, world class. How many kilometers have they laid in Canada's Arctic? 0 kilometers. And what we should do is dual use has many functions. There's always a security route. So if you're laying subsea cables, in some pinch points, you can also have microphones and acoustic devices to monitor shipping, to monitor submarines, as you're going to light up communities that are part of the country. And we actually have an obligation from a reconciliation standpoint, because some of the most extreme north communities, like Grise Fjord, for example, we moved our citizens there. They were called human flagpoles, or that's what it became known, for Arctic security in the Cold War in the 50s. Can you imagine transplanting Northern Cree in Quebec or other Indigenous peoples to these remote communities, no affiliation with the land, in order to say we had population base and we could have rangers and we could have people on the ground? So I think as a country we have an added obligation to make sure that they're not so isolated and cut off. So dual use, here you could light up remote communities, have a security link to alert and to the Northwest Passage, where we could acoustically and through sensors monitor and at least know who's there. We don't have assets to send and go go meet them yet, but that should be our objective. Domain and understanding, and every infrastructure investment we make in the Arctic, as Jessica alluded to, ports, roads, aerodromes, they all have a dual use, because they're all about food security. They're all about economic opportunity. They're all about national defense and security. So infrastructure investments in the north have so many dual use, triple use elements, but you have to commit, and they almost have to be nonpartisan, because Stephen Harper did 3 major initiatives in the Arctic. The High Arctic Research Station, CHARS, which is world class. The road to Tuktoyaktuk, so our first road to the Arctic Ocean. And the third thing was the Naval Refueling Station at Nanisivik. He didn't get to see the opening of any of those facilities in his time as Prime Minister. Nanisivik is still not completed. So if you don't have a bipartisan, long-term objective for these dual use and these important infrastructure investments, they'll get cut by one government, added by another. And so I really hope that on some of these key things, people in the South can realize we owe it to our fellow citizens up there, and everything we do has a dual and triple use. And the line I used to use on the campaign trail, which I just look back fondly on now, is, "We the North should be more than just the Raptors playoff slogan. It should be an obligation that we have as Canadians." Even though there's a very small amount of our population, a big part of our global geopolitical presence now is the North, and we better get serious.
I've been to Nanisivik. It used to be a huge mine, and they actually built the ore processing facility, I think in Montreal, and they floated it up there, and then they sank it in the harbor, and it was a productive mine for decades. And so that infrastructure is there to turn that into something much more important. But I'm going to ask this quick short snapper of you, Erin. Is this dual purpose type infrastructure, is it something that in your view would count towards 2% of your GDP going towards military expenditure?
A lot of it would, absolutely. And now that the path to 2%, you know, I think 10 years ago, only James Bazan and I were asking for 2%, and everyone looked at us funny. Now I think most of the population realizes the world has changed, and we have to be self-sufficient, self-reliant. We need sovereign capability in a lot of these things. Going to the low Earth orbit satellites, do we want them being controlled by Elon Musk? Have you seen his Twitter feed lately? So sovereign capability, you know, Telesat is looking at having a similar system. Sometimes we're going to have to pay a little bit more to not rely on other people. And I think Canadians, if they didn't understand that a week ago, they certainly understood it in the last couple of days. So a lot of these things, Gary, would count in that calculation. Some countries even try and include veteran benefits and a whole range of things in their calculation.
I'm actually advocating to raise pensions as part of 2%.
So there's a lot of ways we can do it, but with dual use, as I said, right now, if we had that fiber connecting the north, we could also monitor shipping in the Northwest Passage. That's security.
Jessica, I'm going to ask you a question because you touched upon your time in Norway. And I must say, I've always been impressed with the Nordic countries, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, and which one am I missing? Finland, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, right. So I guess I did get them. So I mean, you spent time in Norway, and you talked about the relationships with Europe. And it strikes me that Europe is complicated itself, that you've got a group of countries that are denialists. They get their head in the sand over the way the world is changing. You've got people that are Gaullists, that really don't want the United States to be part of anything to do with Europe. You've got Atlanticists that are the typical ones that support NATO. And then you've got some Putinists like Viktor Orban. But I'm going to focus specifically about your time in the Nordic countries. What should we be learning from what they've done in those countries?
Right.
Is that a good question?
No, it's a great question. And sorry, that's a great question. And I would say, well, there's a few things. So Norway, of course, has always had a very big neighbor to its north, which has been Russia. And so when I lived there, it was at a time when there was great interest and effort to recreate good relations with Russia. And there was a Barents cooperation underway at that time. And so while there was a lot of effort in that way to build those relationships, I think, though, Norway itself has always, at least the history that I know, and at least my time there, already like in the early 2000s, it was already understood itself as an Arctic nation, and there wasn't something about like this north that was far away and remote and no one knows anything about it. It was just part of the whole of Norway. We are an Arctic nation. And so I think in those terms, they have always been thinking in line in terms of their own military and Norway's role then within NATO and how it serves, that part, except for many years, Norway wanted to keep NATO out of the Arctic because of its neighbor to the north. But when I lived there, I was on the Russian border. And at that time, there was roads, tunnels, airports, all types of fantastic critical infrastructure. You can be, down in a tunnel and talking on your phone, And so there wasn't this kind of disparity between these understandings of like this great, the north is somewhere and it's so out there. It's something understood, and it was also something understood to be invested in, whether that's to build relationships with Russia or to prepare itself from what potentially, what has been in the past, and understanding that in terms of what might happen in the future. So I would say in that line, the Nordic countries themselves, though, right now, now NATO is, in the Arctic, and so the Arctic nations are taking their, we have between Sweden and Finland now, taking this whole space very seriously and in a whole renewed light, and the European Arctic countries take this stuff very seriously. I mean, they're sending out pamphlets now about how people prepare themselves to live, for several weeks at a time in case of a war. Helsinki itself has a whole entire underground city to survive a war. So for them, I think because maybe perhaps World War II, and so they're closer to it, it's easier to understand and recognize when things are becoming very serious and how to prepare.
Can I add something here? Because Jessica's raised some interesting things. The Nordics, I used to love dealing with the Nordic ambassadors. They all love Canada. There's lots of affinities. But the Nordics are a very distinct group. Norway's not in the EU. A lot of people forget that. And some of the Nordics were not in NATO until recently. And so they had a degree of kind of independence, autonomy. Now, the Russian threat meant that they all take military preparedness and that independence more seriously. I don't know if you've seen the sort of young service programs that Finland has about serving in the military. Gosh, I would love that here. Really just in terms of a citizen service. Could be in uniform, it could be in... But they have always realized that they're going to have to be much more self-reliant. And they've been flirted with almost neutrality at times, but they're not large enough and they're not strong enough to really exist on their own. So this is why in this age of eroding multilateralism, we have to re-strengthen these institutions because very few countries can stand alone. We have to be self-sufficient, but we also have to build alliances that can be really important vehicles for peace and for security. And that's what NATO has been until just recently. And a few years ago when Macron called NATO brain dead, that should have been the sign that the US were waffling on NATO. We were a bit of a free rider, as were others. These important alliances you take for granted, but since World War II, there's been peace in Europe, there's been relative stability. So I think the Nordics can be even better allies now because I think they want to be in this multilateral security blanket. But yeah, they're a unique set of partners.
So, and I would add to all of this, and I'm going to sound like a military guy because I am. I would add to this, if deterrence is the first goal of any nation in the military realm, and I firmly believe it must be your first goal, then you've got to have the capability to know that, that adversary is going to know that if that adversary does something, it's going to hurt. That's what deterrence is at its core. And the lethality, the speed, the reach of modern weapon systems now, you cannot defend Canada if Canada is trying to defend itself on its own. You cannot. A weapon system can launch from the middle of Russia and be here in 17 minutes. And if you don't get that cueing out of the middle of Russia, you will not be able to catch it when you need to at this end. A ballistic missile submarine boat in the middle of the Pacific can get something here in about 25 minutes. So this is not about Canada being an island. Canada has got to create these alliances and partnerships because that creates that deterrence effect, and B, if it gets there, it actually gives you a fighting chance. But that's key to this.
I'm going to sleep so much better tonight. Thank you. Look, actually, Erin, something that you talked about in terms of the uniqueness of the Nordics. We're going to host an event with the Nordic ambassadors this fall, and I'd invite all of you to come out. And it is about what it is that the Nordic countries are doing. We've invited these ambassadors to talk about what they're doing in the Nordic countries that allows their companies to grow and prosper in small markets, right? So you add up the population of the four Nordic countries, that's 0.3% of the population of the world, accounting for more than 1% of the world's GDP. So IKEA, the largest furniture seller in the world, and by reason of Swedish meatballs, the sixth largest restaurant chain in the world. Maersk, the shipbuilding, Lego, the world's biggest toy company, Saab, making fighter jets in Sweden, Novo Nordisk, one of the biggest pharma companies in the world, Ericsson, Nokia. I mean, Nokia is a great example because it's named after the Nokia forest, because 100 years ago they were sawing logs, then they got into rubber boots. That's why you see Nokia tires, and then of course they went into ITC. So we're bringing them in to an event, and I hope you'll come. where we're going to ask them about, maybe we'll get Erin, maybe we can get you to moderate the session. But I think there's lots of lessons to learn. I've got a question on here. So we're here in Manitoba. The far north lacks infrastructure, but we have a port of Churchill on Hudson Bay. What role might that play in our Arctic strategy? Anybody wants to?
That's actually a perfect question. And I think that's a great point, though, in what you're talking, sorry, I don't mean to point when I say point. In terms of the Nordic countries being very good in how government and private sector and actually research work together. And but the governments are more centralized and they're able to bring themselves together to kind of have a short, medium, and long-term plan and strategy. And so I just want to quickly say that and this does feed into the Churchill piece because it reverts back to what we need to do. So when Russia built its Northern Sea route, they actually carried out several feasibility, like economic feasibility studies. So they figured out, well, okay, if we're going to, build this out, what do we need? How much is this going to cost? And then how much are we going to be able to create revenue from? So building up a gas resources, icebreaker, escorts, and the such. And so when it comes back to our north and thinking that through, and I want to also say one more thing that actually comes into this conversation. We've been having this ongoing conversation in this country about our pension funds and, carrots or sticks and whether or not the pension funds should be spending more money inside Canada. So first of all, when it comes to what we need and what we need to build, and therefore Churchill, we need to figure out, first of all, what we have, what we need, and then therefore how much it's going to cost, and then how are we going to finance that. And so we need to have a holistic, we have to build out a strategy for what we need. And I think that areas such as Churchill and the whole road and port piece is a piece of that, because the whole conversation is not just about what we need in the north, but it's connecting the north to the rest of the country. And there's efforts now to also build a port in New Brunswick. And so how do these kind of entities then feed into what we need, which we don't know yet, because we need to be able to sit down and understand the defense needs, the economic needs for in terms of infrastructure and also social infrastructure needs. And so therefore, we start thinking this thing through strategically and how then it connects. But it can't just be how we connect, the west to the east part, but actually how it connects to the rest of the country. I think I want to say one other thing then in terms of the costs, and this is going to cost a lot of money. And one thing that is quite interesting, and if we start thinking, well, maybe in real serious terms, that we are living in serious times. The Defense Corporation Act, when it was created, that actually back in leading up, and it was out of the leading up into the Second World War, came out of the New Deal. So what it did is it did not the Defense Corporation Act didn't just take a ton of money and put that money straight into building military equipment and the such. It took a lot of money and it put it into creating an institution that has legacies to it that enabled financial private capital to invest in a space that's high risk, really risky innovation that they would have never been able to normally invest in. And so what came out of that was actually the U.S. aerospace industry. And it still now has, it's a legacy institution and it continues to innovate. And so if we're starting to think about connecting some of these pieces in terms of our pension funds, the costs required, and strategically thinking about what we need to build, this is where this comes in. And it plays straight, sorry, the last thing is it plays straight into the defense piece. Absolutely, because I was in a conversation the other day with some investor folks and was talking about, okay, these financial mechanisms and what have you, and I was talking about the wartime economy. So, and they say, oh, well, defense is something different. But is it? Because one example could be when you're talking about critical minerals and how we build up our critical minerals. We all know there needs to be from the critical minerals out of the earth to all the way to the end market. And so we need to know what the entire supply chain is, and therefore we need to know what that offtake market is. And we need to know the offtake market and the price. It has to be a guaranteed price. And so thinking that way, then I don't know. Does Department of Defense become that offtake market? How do we bring in and start thinking then through how this is a different kind of economy?
Erin?
Yeah, I bring back all my Manitoba stories to seem legitimate, but when we did our navigation training out of Winnipeg, the flight we did, almost every route was Churchill. So we would fly to Churchill and fly back, landed a few times. I've been a big fan of that critical asset for Canada. The rail route to it, one of our former colleagues ran that for a while. Infrastructure challenges with that, given the terrain, time of year. The port is being used and has had shipments of grain, it's had shipments of ore, but it's only 3 to 4 months a year. And the challenge there is the ice flow comes down into the bottom, into Churchill. And so that opens up and allows you to get out into to open international waters, but it causes real challenges for the port. So this is something that I think has to be a long-term study. I'm really glad, and I was talking to some of the folks in Premier Canoe's office prior to their announcement related to Churchill. What can we do, to make it more than just a temporary season that is financially doable? But I do think in terms of forward operating bases, it's a little too south, ironically, to really be effective for sovereignty. And so I do know there was some talk on whether there could be more facilities there in Arctic. It's not really good enough for that. So what Blair announced today is what a lot of us in the military has been planning for years, is those 3 Western, Central, and Eastern Arctic operating locations.
And I would add one, and it's not Churchill. If you look at the layout of the footprint in the north between Greenland and Canada and Alaska, honestly, given range and everything from a military perspective, you don't need to build out much more in the north. There's one location that should be being built out in almost everyone's opinion that's in uniform, and that is Resolute Bay. Because it's up in the center of the archipelago, it's close to the north, and if you draw a range circle around it, it covers almost all of Canada's Arctic. That is the place. Anyone in the military will tell you that Iqaluit is too far east. It's not a good location. If you're going to do one, it's res, and if you gave the military res with a paved runway, which the community could benefit from, a small modular reactor so they don't have to haul diesel up there every summer, if you were to do things like that in a place like Resolute Bay, it would make a huge difference for the military and start to build out some of those other things.
I've been to Resolute Bay. There's a hotel there called the Norway Inn.
Run by Aussie.
Yeah, it looks like a giant culvert, doesn't it? Yeah, okay. So it's not the prettiest hotel. It's not as elegant as, the Hotel Fort Garry next door, but it was certainly serviceable. It kept me warm. Look, we've talked about the need for infrastructure, but I got a question here from our audience. We need this infrastructure, and everybody's talked about that, but there are huge regulatory delays in getting things approved. And so I'm going to ask Erin to comment on this. I mean, you can see what Elon Musk is trying to do in the United States, trying to reduce regulatory burdens. I think it's important to be bold, but don't be reckless. And I think he's crossed the line into being reckless. Whereas if we look at what the leader, Milei, in Argentina has done, he's actually reduced regulatory burdens. And Argentina is a turnaround story in terms of it's now into positive growth, where it was for many, many years in negative growth. How do we deal with the regulatory burdens that are inhibiting our ability to get things done, Erin?
Oh, that's probably the biggest challenge our country has faced over the last 20 years. And every time we've tried to do something, I got elected in a by-election at the end of 2012, and Prime Minister Harper at the time was trying to reform the environmental assessment process, and there were some changes made to the Navigable Waters Act. Do you remember that? And people were losing their mind. But the federal government shouldn't be regulating the creek in my small town that a canoe can pass up. But the Fraser River, yes. And the St. Lawrence, yes. This creek in my town had 5 agencies and 3 levels of government regulating it. You're never going to get anything done. That's the bad news. The good news is we're a lot better now, Gary, and I think the social license of the country has changed. I think people want to see us more self-sufficient. They want to see us not as reliant on the Americans, quite frankly, and they know that our energy, for example, be it oil and gas, be it critical minerals for EVs, the whole nine, is more sustainable, more ESG friendly than any other supplier in the world. So why wouldn't we prudently leverage that and benefit and even pay for our own critical infrastructure with this? So I think the social license of the country is there now. Another critical factor is First Nations governance. I used to say, and I know James would agree with me, if the First Nations Major Projects Coalition was around in the Harper government, we would have a pipeline, certainly Northern Gateway for sure, but maybe one to Atlantic Canada as well, because now there's, it's accepted that there will be equity partnership and true partnership, not just a duty to consult, and real potential, and there's groups actually raising capital. There's First Nation banks. That didn't exist when we were having these conversations before, and the Assembly of First Nations was generally against any type of resource development. The final thing I'll say is, even if you look at the last few budgets of the Trudeau government, even they have been acknowledging Bill C-69, their review of all this was bad for the country. Biden said it himself in the House of Commons when he came here, because the Americans were willing to invest in our critical minerals in the north through the Defense Production Sharing Agreement, which we've benefited from since World War II. It's why we have a defense industry. It lets the Americans spend their money on a Canadian mine, but Biden said we don't want to wait 17 years for this. We need it now. China has cornered control over a lot of rare earths and a lot of critical minerals. So if we're going to invest American taxpayer dollars, we're not waiting 30 years for that mine to produce. So I think the world has changed, this great realignment, whatever you want, and it's not just Donald Trump, it's the world has changed, and Canada needs to change with it. And I do think we can take the lead. So I think I have my own preferences on who the next government will be. There's the next Minister of Defense if it was up to me. But I won't be partisan here, as much as it's hard for me to not be. Whoever the next government is, I've seen signals that they want to get things done, get things built in Canada. I think Mr. Carney will win. I've seen some of that language out of him, just from following his little clips. And the world wants us. I met 3 German ambassadors over my 10 years. Their number one priority was LNG from Canada. Never hydrogen, they never even mentioned it. LNG from Canada, because they wanted to become less reliant on Russia, but they had no one helping them. So this is not only good for us, if we can get this regulatory burden down, Gary, it'd be good for the world.
So I'm going to ask some short snappers at the end, but before we get to that, I want to say thank you to our sponsors who have helped us with this. We've had significant contributions from Charles N. Holdings, from ATCO, and from CETA International, and we couldn't do these kinds of things without their support, and frankly, any of you that wish to make a tax-deductible contribution to the Canada West Foundation, we gladly accept contributions, large and small. If you write a check that's too big, I promise to send back the difference. But look, we think that we're doing good work. We hope that you've enjoyed this. So now I'm going to go into our sort of last round of questions. I've heard more about the Arctic in the last 10 weeks than perhaps I've heard in the last 10 years combined. So when it comes to the Arctic, getting things done, getting these operating bases put together, infrastructure, policy, I'm going to ask each one of you, are you optimistic or pessimistic? Will Canadians have short memories, or will they remember this moment in time, really accentuated by the Four Nations Cup? I mean, it's amazing that it takes hockey as the thing that unifies us, so that you know, a bunch of Montrealers are actually singing the national anthem out loud in Montreal, and Premier Legault is actually talking about Energy Saguenay to take an LNG pipeline through Quebec. But are you optimistic or pessimistic that the opportunity and the challenges of the Arctic, will we be able to sustain this Canadian sentiment that is happening right now, that it is important? I'll start with you, Colin.
So I'll share a story with you. When I checked into One Canadian Air Division headquarters here in Winnipeg in 2004, after coming up out of an exchange with the United States Marine Corps for 3 years, I get into my desk and I start rooting around. And when you go into a new office in the military, it's always like what hand grenades were left in the bottom drawer of the desk. And it was fascinating because I opened up the bottom drawer of my desk and there was a Canadian Defence Quarterly magazine in the bottom drawer of my desk. That was the first quarter of 1977. And the caption on the cover of the magazine was Arctic Sovereignty. So to your question, I don't know. There's a will building. It takes national will, a national desire to make it happen. And I think we can start talking about national strategies and sovereignty and security when they get to a point where they're no longer partisan. And if we leave these things to be partisan, then I would suggest no.
Erin?
Well, I'm an optimist always, Gary. I think you know me well enough. My podcast and Substack is called Blue Skies. I'm very optimistic. Please subscribe. It's free. I think we will maintain this because I think even if, I've said Trump will actually calm down relatively by June. There will be no tariffs. There'll be some tax challenges and other things. People will be kind of used to the chaos by then. It's very offensive right now because it's just happening. This will become a bit of the new normal. And I think it's shaking the complacency off a lot of Canadians that we can just rely on the traditional systems, the traditional allies. We can sometimes rely on others and the fact that we are well-liked and respected. We have to be more mature and self-sufficient. And so I think this is going to last. And I really hope, and why I talk a lot about the Arctic is, I really hope it becomes this long-term commitment to infrastructure and dual use becomes bipartisan. And the fact that Bill Blair's there today, you know, sure, many of these things were things that we were proposing years ago, but thank goodness they're being done. And we should make sure that some of these things are long-term and survive changes of government. The Australians have done this on defense and other things. They survive changes of the government. They don't have Sea King cancellations. I was on Sea King, so I'm still bitter over that one from 1993. Or F-35 cancellations, then we're back. We have to be long-term, serious, and mature. And I'll leave you on this note. I still get, notes from people and recognized on the streetcar in Toronto. And two policies come up a lot that I talked about for years, and two are the most popular. They still get talked about all the time. One is CANZUK, so us doing more with Australia, New Zealand, the UK, our traditional allies, the four normal of the Five Eyes, you might say, right now. And the other one is the Arctic. I get random people saying, we need to do more. I saw you wrote that thing, or, we need to do more. And I think there's a real desire, even from Canadians that may have never left Portage in Maine or Bay and King in Toronto. They may not have been north of Muskoka, but they think this is nation building. They think this is important for our sovereignty, for our role in the world, but also for our resources, for reconciliation, for a whole range of reasons. So let's capture this interest now and get people into a long term. And that's why I participate. The only NGO other than Canada West that I do things with is Arctic 360. Jessica's building it into a must-attend for private sector, public sector, defense. And Canada, until an American moved here, didn't have an Arctic dedicated think tank. And we are a proud Arctic nation. So let's really harness this. Let's do this once a year, Gary. And thank you for all your interest. It's a journey we're all on together.
Jessica, optimistic or pessimistic?
Let's say both. About the world of about world affairs, I'm unfortunately very pessimistic. I guess I plan for the worst, but hope for the best. In terms of Canada, well, as Erin's pointed out to me, which is the truth, born American, but Canadian by choice. And, moving to this country over 13 years ago now, it's a country that is filled with extremely smart people, amazing academic institutions. It has, financial institutions. It's got this amazingly stable, robust democracy. We have all the means and mechanisms to be really prosperous and to weather through whatever is to come, and come out the other end as a stronger nation. And perhaps that's why then I become so, highlighting the seriousness of the moment, because we need to be serious, and we have every opportunity to do big things. And so for that, if we can all agree and get on with board, I'm very optimistic. Thank you.
Jessica is from San Diego originally, so the most temperate part of North America, and she's the Arctic expert living in Toronto. I always get a kick out of that.
And love the sunshine, so I go figure.
Look, for the record, I am, like Erin, an optimist. And I often have said, and people who have been around me have heard me say, pessimists are often right. Optimists are often wrong. But if anything good happens in the world, it's because an optimist tried to make a difference. Yeah. And so at a public policy think tank, if you don't think you can make a difference, then why bother coming to work? And that's why I take such great pleasure in being with you here today, with our board, including our chairman, retired Senator Doug Black, and all the members of our board that come from across Western Canada, from British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta. And we thank you very much. I'm sure we'll be around to have cookies and coffee with the panelists, but we're going to draw this to a close. And I thank you all very, very much for being here and your good questions. And again, I have to close by saying, if you found that what you learned today was useful, please feel free to make a donation to the Canada West Foundation. Thank you very much.